The heat that day carried the weight of finality, not just the North African sun pressing against our helmets, but the air itself, heavy with smoke and dust. We marched down a narrow track toward the sea, rifles slung like dead branches. The sound of boots was constant, yet without rhythm. Thousands of men shuffling forward, not as an army, but as prisoners. Ahead, the horizon wavered with heat, and columns of black smoke marked the grave of the Afrika Korps. Trucks had burned, fuel had run out, and our commanders told us resistance was finished. I was 24, a Gefreiter, one among 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendering on the Cap Bon Peninsula. I threw my rifle onto a growing heap of weapons. Mausers, pistols, even machine guns clattered together, their power gone the moment we let go. The British and Americans watched us in silence, rifles raised more out of caution than need. There was no fight left in us. We had been taught that Americans were weak, spoiled children of jazz and Coca-Cola. Their soldiers, we were told, lacked the steel of the Wehrmacht. Yet the men I saw were steady and disciplined. Their uniforms were clean, their boots polished, their weapons well oiled. Behind them idled rows of trucks, each loaded with water cans, bread, cigarettes by the carton. It was more than we had seen in weeks. The simple sight of Lucky Strikes being passed around as casually as pebbles left me stunned. An officer barked orders in English, his tone sharp but not cruel. I would later learn his name, Lieutenant Jack Thompson, a transport officer in charge of moving us. He treated us as a task, not as enemies, efficient, unflinching, professional. He had endless machines at his disposal. Behind him stretched convoys of GMC trucks, engines idling like patient beasts. Not a horse in sight. We had relied on horses for half our transport. Theirs came entirely on wheels. The contrast gnawed at me. Our divisions had bled themselves dry, hauling guns through sand and scrub. Horses dying under loads too heavy. Here, every crate was on a truck, every load secured with straps, gasoline sloshing in tanks without fear of running out. To us, fuel was treasure. To them, it was lifeblood pumped without limit. The dust clung to our teeth and burned our throats. Men muttered prayers, others stared hollow-eyed at the horizon. But I found myself watching the Americans' machines. Trucks lined up with stars painted on the doors, canvas covers tied neatly, spare tires bolted to the sides. There were more vehicles in that one staging area than our regiment had possessed in months. I realized for the first time that perhaps the war was not simply lost on the battlefield. It might already have been lost in the factories and workshops we had never seen. Our leaders had promised that German ingenuity would triumph. Yet ingenuity means little without steel and fuel. As I stared at the neat rows of American trucks, I felt something I had never admitted before: doubt. That night we were herded behind barbed wire near the coast. The sea smelled of salt and oil. In the distance, ships loomed against the moonlight, dark shapes waiting to carry us into captivity. I lay on the ground, staring at the stars painted on American vehicles. They seemed to shine even in the dark, as if reflecting a strength that had nothing to do with chance. I thought of Kasserine, where we had mocked these same Americans, calling them amateurs. But amateurs had become professionals in 3 months, while we had only grown weaker. The numbers told the truth. 275,000 prisoners, an army erased in a single campaign. Engines hummed softly in the night, a strange comfort, a lullaby from a power I did not yet understand. Tomorrow would bring ships and a new world. I closed my eyes, clutching my empty canteen, whispering to myself that perhaps the war had been decided long before this day. The ships waited like giants when dawn broke over the harbor at Bizerte. Their steel hulls loomed against the pale sky, painted in grays and blacks, each one bristling with cranes and winches. I had never stood so close to such a vessel before. We called them Liberty ships after hearing the Americans use the word. The very name felt like a taunt to men who had just lost ours. We were herded aboard in silence. The gangplank rattled beneath hundreds of boots. I ran my hand along the railing, rough steel still warm from welding torches. Later, I learned the truth, that these ships were not built in years or even many months, but in weeks. 2,710 of them would be produced before the war was done. One, they said, had been launched in just 4 days. The thought struck me harder than any artillery barrage. A vessel that carried us into captivity had been constructed faster than it took my unit to receive replacement boots. Below deck, the air smelled of oil and paint. Crates lined the holds stacked with mathematical precision. Rations, ammunition, equipment. It seemed we were an afterthought, men crammed in beside the cargo that actually mattered. We sat on benches bolted to the steel floor, listening to the groan of the ship as it shifted against the dock. Soon came the deep thrum of engines, triple expansion steam pistons pushing 14,000 tons of steel into motion. We felt the vibration in our bones as the ship crept out to sea. The voyage was guarded. Destroyers prowled the edges of the convoy, their wakes slicing the waves. We heard talk among guards about U-boats hunting us, though none dared attack. By 1943, they said, America was launching Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them. I thought of the U-boat captains, once Germany's pride, now firing torpedoes into a tide of ships that never ended. To be in such a war was like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. Meals astonished us most. We lined up in the mess, tin trays in hand, and received ladles of thick stew, bread still warm, canned fruit swimming in syrup. The guards ate the same, sometimes laughing, sometimes lighting cigarettes and offering them to us. I tasted Spam for the first time, salty and strange, but rich compared to the crusts and dried sausage we had survived on. I remember a man across from me holding up his tray, shaking his head, whispering that these rations were better than what our frontline troops had received for months. At night, I lay awake on the bunk, the air close with the smell of sweat and steel. I could hear the steady heartbeat of the engines, churning endlessly, never faltering. It felt as if the ship itself was alive, a beast of industry that would not rest. I thought of our own merchant fleet, dwindling with every passing month under Allied bombs. Germany had never imagined ships could be built at such speed, in such numbers. We had thought victory depended on bravery and tactics, but here, locked in the belly of a Liberty ship, I began to understand that victory belonged to those who could produce. Some prisoners whispered of home, of families left behind. Others speculated about where we were headed. America was a word heavy with mystery, a place none of us had seen, but all had heard of. We had been told it was a land of decadence. Yet if decadence meant this, ships faster than submarines, food in endless supply, guards who treated even their prisoners with mechanical fairness, then decadence had already defeated us. On the third night, I ventured on deck under the watchful eyes of sentries. The convoy stretched beyond sight, ships moving in perfect formation, their silhouettes lit by moonlight. Smoke from their stacks drifted together into one long plume, a trail across the sea. I gripped the railing, feeling the cool spray on my face. Behind us lay a lost continent of desert battles. Ahead lay an unknown captivity. Between them stretched the ocean, conquered not by armies, but by steel and factories. I thought of the pile of rifles left in the sand at Cap Bon. Weapons alone had not been enough. The Americans had made victory into an industry, and we were cargo in its machinery. The engines beat below my feet, steady as a drum, carrying us westward toward a world richer than anything we had been led to believe. I closed my eyes and listened, knowing that each stroke of the pistons echoed the truth. We had been fighting a nation not of soldiers alone, but of machines without number. The first glimpse of America came not with the grandeur I had imagined, but with the quiet roll of countryside passing outside a train window. After disembarking from the ship, we were herded onto rail cars, their wooden benches creaking beneath us. The rhythm of steel wheels began, a steady clatter that soon lulled men into silence. We stared out at a land none of us had seen before. Fields stretched endlessly, green and gold under the summer sun. Barns stood neat and painted, silos rose like sentinels beside them. And everywhere there were machines, tractors pulling plows across wide fields, harvesters moving steadily, engines coughing smoke as they worked. I pressed my forehead against the glass, watching in disbelief. Where were the peasants with scythes? Where were the horses pulling carts? Germany still depended on them. Here the machines worked without pause, without complaint. Entire farms seemed to run with barely a man in sight. One of the guards, perhaps amused at our stares, explained in simple German, "Most of the young men are in the army. The machines do the work, and sometimes the prisoners." He smiled as if this were obvious. The words struck me harder than his rifle ever could. We had sacrificed our men to labor, starving them at the front while wives and children struggled to keep farms alive. Here, it seemed, technology replaced bodies. The train slowed through small towns. To our astonishment, civilians waved. Children pointed at us, their mothers tugging them back, but not in fear. There was curiosity in their eyes, even pity. A boy ran alongside, shouting, "Hey, Krauts!" But he grinned as he said it, as if mocking were more sport than hatred. We were prisoners, yet treated as though we were simply passing travelers. I wondered what my family back in Munich would think, to see us greeted not with stones, but with stares. When we stopped for water, I caught the scent of bread baking from a nearby house. The smell was so rich it made my stomach twist. One of the Red Cross volunteers, a young woman with auburn hair, handed out cups of water. She moved with quiet efficiency, speaking to the guards but glancing at us. Later, I would learn her name, Clara Williams. To us, she was simply another face of this impossible land, a civilian volunteer who treated prisoners with humanity. The abundance around us was everywhere, even in things the Americans took for granted. At a station we passed, crates of oranges were stacked high, their bright skins glowing under the sun. Oranges in summer in such numbers, while our rations in Africa had dwindled to hard biscuits and tinned meat. A man beside me muttered, "They live like kings," and no one argued. As miles turned into hours, the landscape unfolded without end. Rivers glittered under bridges. Trucks roared along highways parallel to the tracks. I counted more vehicles in a single hour than our division had possessed at the start of the campaign. Each one carried supplies, soldiers, or civilians, all moving with purpose. Even in the heart of their country, war hummed like an engine, steady and unstoppable. We finally arrived at a depot where military police guided us down from the rail cars. I stepped onto the platform and felt the boards shake beneath hundreds of boots. Across the yard stood rows of trucks, each painted with white stars, waiting to ferry us farther inland. I realized then that this was only the beginning. We were to be scattered across camps. Thousands of us housed in places so numerous the Americans spoke of them casually, as if running hundreds of prison facilities was no strain at all. That night, under guard, I lay on a cot for the first time in months. The mattress was thin, the blanket coarse, yet it was clean. Through the open window, I heard the distant whistle of another train and smelled the faint sweetness of cut hay drifting in. Machines harvested fields by moonlight, their engines buzzing. Even in the dark, America worked. I thought again of the endless fields, of tractors plowing without men, of children waving without fear. It struck me that we were not only prisoners of war, but witnesses to a civilization decades ahead of ours. We had come believing America was decadent. Instead, we found a land where machines replaced hunger, where abundance was ordinary, and where even prisoners slept on clean sheets. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady murmur of industry in the distance, and realized the war had already been lost long before we crossed the ocean. The first morning in Camp Algona began with cold air so sharp it stung my lungs. Iowa was not Africa. The heat and dust of Tunisia seemed like another planet. Here, the sky stretched wide and clean, and the wind carried the smell of cornfields and wood smoke. We shuffled from the barracks to the mess hall, our boots crunching on frost. I had not felt winter in 2 years, and I was unprepared for how it cut through the thin cloth of my issued coat. Yet the cold was nothing compared to the shock of what awaited us inside. Long tables groaned under trays of food. The line moved briskly, eggs steaming, bread sliced thick, milk poured into metal pitchers, butter set in bowls as if it were endless. I gripped my tray with both hands, staring at the bounty as if it might vanish. The guard behind me muttered, "Keep moving," but I could not help it. To a man who had lived on crusts and watery soup, this was more than a meal. It was a revelation. The barracks themselves were heated, stoves clattering with coal. Blankets were coarse but clean, bunks solid. We were issued work clothes for labor and library cards for the shelves in the recreation hall. I laughed when I first heard it, a library for prisoners. Yet there it was, rows of books in English and German, even dictionaries to help us learn. America not only fed us but expected us to read. Work began quickly. Groups of us were sent to local farms, escorted by guards who seemed more bored than wary. The farmers greeted us with nods, sometimes even handshakes. We hauled hay, fixed fences, picked corn, earning small wages that we could spend in the camp canteen. I remember holding an American candy bar in my hands for the first time. It felt absurd. Chocolate for a prisoner, when back home even children went without. In December, 6 men from among us began building a nativity scene. They asked permission to use scraps of wood and cement, and the Americans agreed. What started as a small project grew into something larger than any of us imagined. Figures were carved: Mary, Joseph, shepherds, wise men, life-sized and carefully painted. The smell of wet cement filled the workshop, the dust clinging to our clothes. We poured our labor into it as if each figure were a way to prove we were still men, not just numbers. By Christmas, 65 figures stood completed. Even the guards admired it, and the townspeople came to see. The irony did not escape me. In Europe, our soldiers froze in trenches without boots. Here, in the heart of America, prisoners of war were supplied with materials to build art. That contrast burned inside me more deeply than any propaganda leaflet. If a nation could spare cement for prisoners' sculptures, what could it not spare for its own armies? News trickled into the camp through bulletin boards. We learned of Allied advances in Italy, of bombing raids over Germany. Casualties mounted, cities crumbled. Yet here in Iowa, the war seemed far away, a shadow rather than a storm. Even the rationing Americans spoke of seemed generous compared to what our families endured. One guard complained he could not find enough sugar for his wife's baking, and I nearly laughed aloud. Sugar for cakes, while Europe starved. At night, lying in the barracks, I listened to the wind rattle the walls and thought of home. I imagined my mother queuing for bread in Munich, my father working in a factory without coal. I thought of comrades still in Africa, buried under sand. And then I thought of the nativity we had built, glowing under lantern light, standing as proof that America had wealth enough to let its prisoners create beauty in the midst of war. The camp was not paradise. There was boredom, homesickness, and the humiliation of captivity. Yet in every detail, the food, the warmth, the books, the art, I saw evidence of a nation decades ahead. For the first time, I admitted to myself that Germany could not win. We were fighting a country where even prisoners lived better than many free men at home. When the lights dimmed and the stoves clicked quietly in the dark, I whispered the words I'd heard another prisoner speak that day. Words that captured all our disbelief. America beats, by far, anything. Each morning in Algona, after work details and meals, we gathered around the bulletin board in the recreation hall. It became a ritual. Notices were posted in German and English, farm assignments, camp rules, sometimes news clippings. At first I read them only to pass the time. Then I began to notice the numbers. They appeared like casual lines in articles, but to us they were thunderclaps. One headline spoke of American aircraft production, 297,000 planes to be built by war's end. The figure seemed impossible, a misprint. Germany had produced perhaps 120,000 by then. Japan even fewer. Yet the Americans spoke of their totals as if they were expected, routine. I stared at the number until it blurred, trying to comprehend how one nation could produce more planes than all its enemies combined. Another day brought statistics about tanks, 86,000 American machines already rolling from assembly lines, painted with stars, shipped to every front. I remembered our panzer divisions in Africa, dwindling to a handful of working vehicles, men fighting with rifles against artillery. 86,000 was not a number, it was an avalanche. The guards sometimes explained these clippings perhaps to remind us of the futility of our war. One sergeant spoke of the M1 Garand rifle, the standard weapon of every American infantryman. He held it up once, showing us the mechanism. It fired 8 rounds from an en-bloc clip, semi-automatic, 40 to 50 shots a minute. I compared it silently to my Mauser bolt action. Accurate, but slow. We had mocked the Americans at Kasserine, thinking them untrained. But with a weapon like this in every soldier's hands, no wonder they had overwhelmed us. Word spread, too, of the B-24 Liberator, a bomber I had seen only from afar. Now I learned Ford's Willow Run plant produced one every 59 minutes. At first I laughed. How could a bomber, wingspan over 100 feet, 4 engines, be built faster than we could manufacture replacement parts for a single aircraft? Yet the reports were consistent. In a single month, that factory produced more bombers than some nations managed in a year. I found myself both awed and unsettled. This was war transformed into industry. Not just battles fought by men, but battles fought by factories, assembly lines, and endless rivers of raw material. America had turned production itself into a weapon. Every statistic was a bullet fired at the heart of the Axis. Clara, the Red Cross nurse who visited often, once explained the idea of victory ships that were replacing Liberty ships. They were faster, larger, stronger. Over 500 were already at sea. She spoke casually, as if everyone knew. I asked how long they took to build, and she shrugged. Weeks, sometimes less. My mind returned to the wrecks in Africa, to supply lines stretched thin, to German industry choked by bombing. We were fighting on scraps. They were fighting on abundance. The other prisoners reacted in different ways. Some dismissed the numbers as propaganda, refusing to believe them. Others grew quiet, their eyes haunted. I found myself caught between disbelief and acceptance. Each new figure struck like artillery, thousands of planes, thousands of tanks, millions of trucks. And not once did the flow seem to slow. At night, in the barracks, I thought of the Garand rifle. I imagined lines of American soldiers, each firing twice as fast as we could. Then I pictured the bombers, each carrying bombs heavier than our horses could drag, each one rolling from a factory every hour. And then I thought of the ships, endless convoys moving across the ocean, stars painted on their bows, faster than submarines could sink them. It was as though America itself was a machine, grinding forward without pause. The war we had been taught to believe in, of courage, of discipline, of genius strategy, seemed almost quaint now. Courage cannot outlast bombers built by the hour. Discipline cannot stop convoys launched by the thousand. And strategy falters when the enemy simply replaces every loss with 10 more. I pressed my hand against the bunk's wooden frame, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips. It was solid, simple, American-made. Even the wood felt abundant. I thought of my father in Munich, rationing coal, patching old tools. We had been promised victory through sacrifice. But here, in captivity, I began to see that victory was not about sacrifice. It was about supply. The bulletin board was changed again the next morning. Another clipping, another figure, another reminder. America did not boast. It counted. And the counting itself was proof that we, and everything we had fought for, were already finished. The sound of American artillery on Saipan was unlike anything Sergeant Kenji Takahashi had ever known. It began before dawn and did not stop until the sky glowed with fire. The ground trembled, sand and ash falling from the ceiling of the cave where he and his comrades huddled. Each shell was a hammer blow, and together they became a storm. Takahashi pressed his palms against his ears, but the thunder still reached into his bones. He had been told the Americans would come, that they would try to seize this volcanic island in the Marianas. The 31st Army had prepared defenses, bunkers, and tunnels, promising to make the Americans pay dearly. But as the days dragged on, it became clear that no preparation was enough. The enemy landed in June 1944, bringing with them not just men but machines in numbers that defied reason. From the cave mouth, Takahashi saw Sherman tanks grinding across the beaches, their engines roaring, treads cutting into sand as if it were nothing. Marines advanced behind them, rifles at the ready, radios crackling. 18 battalions of American artillery fired in unison, shells arching in great parabolas, landing with dreadful precision. Japanese positions that had taken weeks to dig were erased in minutes. He had fought in China before, but never against an enemy with such weight behind every step. The air above was no refuge. American planes circled constantly, Hellcats, Avengers, Corsairs, swooping down to drop bombs or strafe. Once Takahashi watched as a line of Japanese aircraft rose to meet them, only to be torn apart in the sky. The rumors spread quickly. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, more than 300 Japanese planes had been destroyed in a single day. It was called a turkey shoot, as if skilled pilots had been no more than birds in open season. In the caves, food grew scarce. Rice was rationed to handfuls, water dripped from condensation and was shared by dozens. Men gnawed at roots, sometimes adding weeds to stretch the rations. Ammunition dwindled as quickly as strength. Officers urged them to fight to the death, to embrace the honor of sacrifice. But Takahashi saw the fear in his comrades' eyes. They were not blind. They knew the enemy could replace every bullet, every plane, every tank, while Japan could not. The Americans seemed to bring everything with them: water tanks, field hospitals, ice machines, even music on the radio. Prisoners captured in brief moments of chaos spoke of canned fruit, chocolate, and cigarettes in every ration. Takahashi tried not to believe it, but the smell of American food sometimes drifted into the caves on the wind. It was salt and meat, rich and warm, unlike the thin gruel they scraped from their kettles. The decisive moment came at night when orders were given for a final banzai charge. Thousands of men rose from their hiding places, bayonets fixed, and hurled themselves against the American lines. Takahashi joined, screaming until his throat burned, charging through tracer fire and the roar of machine guns. It was madness, but it was obedience. By dawn, the ground was carpeted with bodies. Only a fraction survived. He staggered back, wounded, smoke and blood filling his nostrils. The sun rose on silence, broken only by the groans of the dying. Captured at last, he expected execution. Instead, medics treated his wounds. They gave him water, real water, poured from clean canisters. He drank until his belly ached. A guard pressed a cigarette into his fingers. For a moment, Takahashi did not know whether to cry or to laugh. In the days that followed, he saw with his own eyes the scale of American abundance. Crates of ammunition stacked higher than men, rows of Shermans idling, aircraft carriers on the horizon disgorging planes by the dozen. It was not just victory, it was inevitability made visible. He thought of his homeland, of factories short on steel, of pilots training on wooden frames because there were no real planes left. Compared to this, Japan was already a relic. On Saipan, Takahashi understood what many Axis soldiers across the world were learning at the same time. They had been taught that courage and sacrifice could overcome any odds. But courage does not refill empty magazines, and sacrifice does not stop artillery that never ceases. Watching the Americans prepare for their next advance, he realized that the war had shifted beyond the reach of bravery. It belonged now to those who could build without end. He closed his eyes, hearing again the unbroken rhythm of American artillery. It was the sound of a future Japan could not match, a drumbeat of industry that drowned out the old world. For Takahashi, survival itself felt like betrayal. Yet even in defeat, he could not deny what he had seen, a nation so rich in machines and men that fighting it was no longer war. It was suicide. The desert sun rose like a relentless overseer over the sands of El Alamein. Captain Hans Vogel wiped sweat from his brow, his uniform already stiff from dust and heat, while the distant rumble of Allied tanks grew louder with every passing minute. He had been briefed on the American presence in North Africa, though intelligence reports often underplayed their scale. What he witnessed now shattered any illusion. Across the horizon, columns of Sherman and Stuart tanks advanced with a discipline and speed that seemed almost unnatural in this unforgiving landscape. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had once relied on cunning maneuvers, quick strikes, and precise coordination to offset the numerical superiority of the Allies. Yet even his famed Africa Corps could not conceal the creeping dread. American artillery had been emplaced with surgical precision. 105mm howitzers, their barrels glinting in the sun, could reach over 10 kilometers, their shells arriving with terrifying accuracy. Each detonation kicked up sand, creating a fog that masked the true number of approaching units. Vogel counted them, 12 battalions advancing in synchronized waves, far more than any Axis officer had expected. The scale of American industrial support became evident as engineers moved behind the lines. Cranes lifted freshly repaired tanks from transport vehicles, while truck convoys delivered fuel and munitions at rates that defied belief. One day, American factories in Detroit and Cleveland had produced more armor in a single shift than Germany could muster in an entire month. Vogel knew it as a statistic that seemed impossible, yet he saw it with his own eyes. The sheer weight of machines, metal, and human determination pressing down on the desert. In the villages and oases that dotted the coast, civilians had fled, leaving behind wells and houses that became impromptu observation posts. Vogel climbed one such vantage point and saw American logistics in motion. Trucks offloading food, water, and ammunition in an organized chain. Troops resting, mechanics tuning engines, and medics treating wounded soldiers almost immediately. The contrast with Axis operations was stark. Supply lines stretched thin, and every victory was paid for in blood. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to treat material as if it were infinite. The German and Italian forces launched counterattacks trying to break through the advancing line. Panzer IVs and Stu Gs clashed with Shermans, and artillery from both sides shook the dunes. Vogel witnessed extraordinary acts of bravery, gun crews manning their positions despite withering fire, engineers repairing tanks in the open under enemy shells. But these acts, as gallant as they were, could not overcome the imbalance of production. For every tank destroyed, two more took its place. For every wounded soldier, fresh troops arrived to fill the line. Rommel himself rode along the front, his face etched with concern and fatigue. His strategies, once infallible, now faltered against an opponent whose industrial base turned the desert into a proving ground for American abundance. Vogel could hear him instructing divisions to pull back, to consolidate, to avoid total annihilation. The retreat, however, was complicated by relentless pressure. American artillery, now reinforced by long-range naval bombardments from offshore cruisers, kept the desert shaken. Ammunition and fuel were delivered with astonishing efficiency, allowing continuous shelling without pause. At night, Vogel lay in his dugout, listening to the hum of American trucks and distant gunfire, realizing that this was more than a battle. It was a demonstration of systemic superiority. Unlike Germany, which relied on tactical genius and ingenuity to compensate for scarcity, America leveraged quantity as a strategic weapon. Their engineers innovated on the fly, modifying Sherman armor and tank guns to match conditions, repairing what would have been total losses elsewhere, and replacing them faster than his corps could destroy. The next morning he witnessed an engagement that seemed impossible. An entire platoon of German tanks was overrun within an hour, yet the Americans had lost barely a dozen vehicles. The ratio was staggering, perhaps 50-1. Vogel could hardly comprehend it. He thought of the factories back home, the endless churn of steel and manpower, the assembly lines that seemed to breathe life into machines. North Africa was no longer a contest of skill alone. It was a race against a nation that produced as if war itself were a natural rhythm. As Rommel ordered a strategic withdrawal, Vogel rode alongside, watching the Americans press forward methodically, almost imperially. Every advance they made was not a gamble, but a calculation, a testament to the marriage of industrial might and disciplined strategy. The sun rose higher, bleaching the sand and illuminating the graveyard of vehicles left behind, evidence of heroism met with inevitability. Vogel understood then that no desert fox, no matter how clever, could outpace a nation whose strength lay not just in men or guns, but in its capacity to create, sustain, and endure beyond measure. By dusk, the Afrika Korps had retreated to the southern dunes, weary and diminished. The Americans consolidated their gains, trucks humming, engines idling, artillery at the ready. The impossible had become tangible, a logistical triumph that reshaped the battlefield before a single decisive battle had been fought. Vogel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the moment, the quiet recognition that industrial supremacy had already won the day, even if courage had not yet been extinguished. The morning fog hung over the Detroit River like a silver veil, and the distant clatter of machinery rose in steady waves, punctuated by the hiss of steam and the occasional clang of steel striking steel. Inside the sprawling Ford Rouge plant, assembly lines stretched as far as the eye could see, a river of workers moving in synchronized precision. Sarah Donnelly, a 23-year-old welder, tightened a rivet on a Sherman tank hull, the heat from her torch mingling with the metallic scent of fresh steel. She could feel history under her fingers. Each plate she set, each bolt she hammered, was a small but crucial contribution to a force that no battlefield genius could rival. America's industrial engine was in full swing. On this single day, the plant would churn out 43 M4 Shermans, a number that represented what entire Axis factories could barely produce in a month. Trucks loaded with ammunition, engines, and spare parts rolled off the lines, their tires thick with grease, ready to traverse deserts, jungles, and European roads. Engineers adjusted engines for optimal performance under extreme conditions. Mechanics fine-tuned turret rotation mechanisms, and logistics officers recorded every output with meticulous care. The scale was staggering, almost poetic, a mechanical symphony conducted by human hands. Across the floor, African American and immigrant workers shared the same space, united not by rank or station, but by purpose. Eleanor Schmidt, an inspector in the Ordnance Division, examined shell casings for microscopic defects, aware that a single flaw could doom a crew half a world away. Every detail mattered. Shells were stamped with lot numbers and production dates, tracked through a web of supply chains that spanned the continent. The complexity was immense. Engines calibrated to 500 horsepower, tracks made from hardened manganese steel, suspension systems reinforced to survive rugged terrain, all flowing from a factory that had once produced civilian cars to a battlefield instrumentality beyond imagination. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, German commanders worried over their dwindling resources. The same morning that Ford's lines hummed with life, Rommel's supply lines creaked under the weight of attrition. American shipments of tanks, artillery, and fuel were arriving faster than Axis planners could account for. One American convoy delivered more armor in 12 hours than the German army could assemble in an entire month, and Allied engineers adapted the vehicles for desert warfare with astonishing speed. Each piece of machinery represented not just a weapon, but a promise that American ingenuity could outpace any strategy, no matter how cunning. The assembly hall itself seemed to breathe. Conveyors carried hulls to turret assembly stations where mechanics fitted 75mm guns, adjusting recoil springs and calibrating elevation mechanisms. Paint crews applied coats that would withstand blistering sun and corrosive salt air. Testing bays echoed with the roar of engines, vibrations running through the floorboards as technicians recorded torque, horsepower, and suspension deflection. Sarah paused for a moment, wiping sweat from her brow, realizing that the sheer volume of production, numbers almost impossible to fathom, was itself a weapon. At lunch, Foreman reviewed production charts, noting that this week alone, the Rouge plant would produce over 300 tanks, equivalent to the combined output of Italian and German factories in the same period. Each vehicle was a symbol of America's ability to convert raw material into decisive battlefield advantage. Steel, rubber, and manpower were transformed into an unyielding force, ready to be deployed wherever strategy demanded. Unlike enemy nations whose scarcity dictated cautious maneuvers, Americans could rely on abundance to dictate terms of engagement. As afternoon light fell through the industrial skylights, attention turned to the transport network. Trains loaded with finished vehicles rumbled toward ports, awaiting convoys that would sail across the Atlantic under naval escort. Mechanics performed final inspections, ensuring engines could endure months of operation in extreme conditions. The coordination was precise, almost invisible in its efficiency. Each tank, shell, and truck represented not only industrial capacity, but the democratic spirit, civilians working collectively to empower soldiers on distant battlefields. By dusk, the factory floor quieted only slightly. A few night shifts took over, continuing the relentless cycle. The impossible statistic was clear. In just 24 hours, American labor and ingenuity had created an arsenal that the Axis could neither match nor hope to disrupt. Sarah paused to watch a freshly completed Sherman roll toward the staging area, the steel glinting under the fading sun. She imagined it moving across deserts and hills, protecting comrades and advancing civilization itself. The day ended with a quiet sense of awe. The machinery would continue its rhythm through night and into the next day, an unstoppable testament to American industrial democracy. Across the Atlantic, Rommel's troops faced the desert not just as soldiers, but as adversaries against a tide they could not reverse. The arsenal of democracy had revealed itself fully, not in a single battle, but in the steady, inexorable creation of tools and men destined to reshape the world. The desert sun scorched the sand into a blinding white haze, and the rumble of engines echoed across the dunes like distant thunder. Lieutenant James Jimmy Callahan squinted against the glare as he watched a column of newly issued M4 Shermans move into position. The tank's tracks chewed the sand with precise efficiency, and their 75mm guns swiveled smoothly, the turrets gleaming under the relentless sun. Jimmy, barely 21, felt a mix of awe and responsibility. Each vehicle represented the culmination of a continent's labor, yet on this battlefield, human skill would decide if steel could truly dominate. The American forces were experimenting with combined arms tactics that had been meticulously refined in the weeks prior. Infantry, artillery, and armor operated not as separate entities but as synchronized units, with forward observers transmitting coordinates for artillery strikes while tanks advanced to suppress enemy positions. Radio operators, perched in sandbagged observation posts, relayed information in a rapid-fire exchange of frequencies, ensuring that every shell landed precisely where it was intended. Each movement was calculated to exploit enemy weaknesses, a system born from extensive training and the logistical certainty of American production. In the distance, German panzer divisions scouted the dunes. They had learned to respect the Sherman's mobility, but their supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. One of Jimmy's sergeants pointed out a formation of Panzer III tanks advancing on a ridge. Their armor was thinner than the Sherman's, and their ammunition supplies limited. American crews had been trained to exploit this exact vulnerability. Fire concentrated on leading vehicles to halt momentum, then flank maneuvers to encircle and neutralize the threat. Within minutes, the first shells struck, sending sand and fragments into the air, the shockwave palpable even at 100 meters away. Behind the lines, the scale of America's advantage became apparent. Entire divisions could be resupplied within days, a process that enemy forces could only dream of matching. One shipment arriving at Oran carried more fuel and ammunition than the Germans produced in a month across all North African factories. Sherman tanks could advance without fear of running dry. Artillery could fire sustained barrages. Infantry units could march with the confidence that every logistical need had been met. It was an almost absurd level of preparedness, a statistical advantage that felt almost mythical to those who understood the numbers. Jimmy's crew executed a flanking maneuver with a precision that could only be achieved with hours of coordinated drills. Gunner Corporal Ruiz lined up the sights, calculating angles and distances with the instinct born of repeated simulation. The first Panzer fell, its turret twisting uselessly, the sand around it erupting in sparks and fragments. Then another. Within 20 minutes, the once intimidating German advance was a scattered, retreating force. Jimmy looked across the battlefield and realized that this was not luck. It was the predictable outcome of industrial might translated into tactical innovation. Communication, coordination, and continuous adaptation were key. Forward observers adjusted fire mid-battle. Tanks repositioned to cover advancing infantry, and engineers moved quickly to fill gaps or repair damaged vehicles. Each American unit operated as part of a larger, highly integrated system. Enemy forces could maneuver tactically, but they could not match the scale, speed, or adaptability of the Americans. Every destroyed enemy vehicle represented not just a battlefield victory, but a validation of months of production and training, the marriage of mechanical engineering and human initiative. By evening, the dunes were littered with the remnants of defeated enemy units. Jimmy watched the sun sink behind the horizon, painting the sand in blood red and gold. Casualties were minimal on the American side, a testament to both the Sherman's armor and superior tactics. Across the desert, the enemy regrouped, but the day's events had revealed an unshakable truth. Quantity, quality, and innovation, fused with disciplined execution, rendered any counterattack almost futile. Night fell, and the soldiers took stock. Radio operators received reports of incoming supply convoys, bringing fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements that would allow operations to continue without pause. Engineers maintained tanks under floodlights. Mechanics adjusted tracks and engines, and commanders planned the next advance with meticulous attention to detail. The lessons learned today would inform the campaigns to come. The desert had become a proving ground not just for courage, but for the limitless potential of American industrial power applied strategically. Jimmy finally leaned against the hull of his Sherman, exhausted but exhilarated. The dunes seemed endless, but the confidence in their machinery, tactics, and teamwork made them feel conquerable. Tomorrow, they would move again, relentless and precise. The combination of unprecedented production, tactical innovation, and disciplined execution was beginning to reveal a pattern that enemy forces could not break. In the desert's vast expanse, one immutable fact became clear. American ingenuity and abundance had reshaped the battlefield entirely, setting the stage for victories far beyond North Africa. The morning light cut across the assembly lines like a knife, illuminating the rhythmic clatter of machinery that seemed almost alive. At the Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal, presses stamped steel with relentless precision. Conveyors carried turret halves down the length of the plant, and workers, men and women alike, moved with a choreography honed to perfection. Each component told a story: a gear machined to exact tolerance, a hull welded with enduring strength, a cannon barrel bored to millimeter perfection. The scale was staggering. Within 1 week, the plant could produce enough M4 Sherman components to equip an entire Panzer division twice over. From the perspective of factory foreman William Bill Henderson, the work was personal as well as patriotic. He walked between the lines, checking torque on bolts, confirming tolerances, and quietly encouraging the newest recruits. These were ordinary citizens transformed into soldiers of industry. The numbers alone were impossible to ignore. By 1943, American factories were producing 28,000 aircraft per year, more than the Luftwaffe could assemble in 6 months. For tanks, the output was equally absurd. Over 18,000 Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines in a single year, a quantity that would have taken the Germans 3 years to match under ideal conditions. Bill could almost hear the enemy commanders' frustration, knowing they would face an opponent whose industrial base was both unstoppable and intricately coordinated. Engineers in the plant monitored every specification, tweaking assembly sequences for maximum efficiency. The coordination between metallurgy experts, machinists, and logistics officers ensured not just quantity, but quality. Each Sherman could survive hits that would have destroyed older models, and every aircraft produced met exacting standards of speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Bill knew that every rivet tightened and every cannon calibrated contributed directly to victory overseas. In this sense, the factories themselves had become the front line, the unsung battlefield where democracy's abundance was transformed into a weapon of war. By noon, statisticians began their daily analysis. Reports compared production outputs with projected enemy strength, calculating ratios that seemed almost fantastical. One analyst noted that the combined output of the U.S. steel mills in a single day could supply the entire German war industry for 2 weeks. Trucks rolled out from depots filled with ammunition, artillery shells, and spare parts, every delivery coordinated with military planners to ensure no unit in the field ever paused for lack of resources. The precision of logistics mirrored the precision of combat. Every number, every calculation, reinforced the notion that American power was systemic, not accidental. Even as these figures swirled on paper, the human cost remained at the forefront. Correspondence from the front reminded foremen and planners of the lives their work supported. Infantry letters described the reliability of Sherman tanks under fire, the life-saving efficiency of supply drops, and the morale boost provided by air support delivered in perfect synchrony. Every statistical miracle, every impossible ratio of production to enemy output, was grounded in the reality of individual bravery and sacrifice. The human and industrial narratives were inseparable, each validating the other in a cycle of relentless effectiveness. By afternoon, the enormity of the arsenal of democracy became almost tangible. Entire factories producing more than an enemy nation's monthly output, convoys of trucks delivering hundreds of tons of supplies daily, and stockpiles of shells and fuel surpassing any conceivable enemy plan. These were not abstractions, but the new reality. In a single day, American industry could create more firepower than the Axis could deploy in an entire campaign. Engineers, operators, and planners understood that they were not just working for victory. They were creating a system so overwhelming that defeat was improbable if maintained. As evening approached, Bill walked to the plant's observation deck, watching the sun reflect off newly assembled Sherman tanks lined up like a metallic army awaiting orders. He imagined the same tanks rolling across North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, each piece of steel a testament to the American way, inventive, abundant, and resolutely democratic. Beyond the statistics lay strategy. Beyond the numbers lay freedom defended by coordinated effort and relentless ingenuity. The impossible production figures had become proof, not just of industrial might, but of an ideology made tangible on the battlefield. When night fell, the plant hummed on. Cranes lifted massive hulls, welding arcs flared like miniature suns, and conveyors continued their endless march. Bill knew that tomorrow the numbers would rise again, each figure a new layer in the edifice of victory. For the men and women who toiled here, every day was a rehearsal for history itself. The scale, the precision, the sheer improbability of the output had become a new weapon, one that would shape battles, campaigns, and the future of the world. The statistical reckoning was clear. Abundance, discipline, and ingenuity had made American victory inevitable. Bill turned from the observation deck, the clang of steel and the rhythmic roar of engines following him like a promise. Across continents, across deserts and oceans, these numbers would translate into victories measured in both terrain gained and lives saved. And as the stars began to emerge, he felt a profound sense of connection between each rivet tightened, each shell packed, and the soldiers whose survival depended on it. America's industrial might had become an extension of its democratic ideals, proving that the marriage of freedom and production could rewrite the rules of war. The dawn broke over the Ardennes with a mist that clung to the pine trees like wool, muffling the rumble of distant artillery. At the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, planners pored over maps and reports, eyes scanning the grids that defined thousands of miles of potential engagement. From this vantage, war was both numbers and nuance, troop movements, supply lines, and the relentless arithmetic of production intersected in a choreography that was as much science as art. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis, an operations analyst, studied the daily production reports streaming from Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia, tracing the invisible thread that linked American factories to frontline success. Each Sherman tank, each P-51 Mustang, each crate of ammunition was a vector in a strategy that could overwhelm any conventional defense. Ellis's office smelled of ink, steel, and coffee, a heady perfume of planning under pressure. The intelligence officers presented estimates of German armor divisions, their fuel reserves, and projected capabilities. Even under optimistic assumptions, the Americans could outproduce, outmaneuver, and outlast. The numbers were impossible on paper. 1 week's American steel output could provide armor for 3 panzer divisions, while American aircraft production exceeded Luftwaffe replacement rates by a ratio of 5-to-1. In a quiet moment, Ellis reflected that the war's decisive battles were no longer fought solely on hills or in cities. They were waged in assembly lines, foundries, and logistics offices where precision dictated survival. Field reports arrived highlighting the synergy between industrial might and tactical innovation. The M4 Sherman, often underestimated by the enemy, excelled when combined with coordinated artillery, air cover, and mechanized infantry. Casualty ratios underscored the effect of this systemic advantage. For every American life lost, dozens of enemy soldiers fell, a staggering figure that reflected not just training, but the profound superiority of resources. Even the German commanders, who valued initiative and skill, faced the stark reality of being outproduced, outgunned, and strategically encircled before battles began. Ellis moved her pointer along the map, calculating supply chain efficiencies. Trucks, ships, and rail cars synchronized like clockwork to deliver fuel, ammunition, and rations to units poised for attack. Each logistical success reduced attrition, increased operational tempo, and translated industrial excess into battlefield dominance. She remembered a letter from a frontline sergeant noting that the steady rain of shells and bombs, though terrifying, had been anticipated. Resupply had arrived before shortages ever became critical. In these moments, strategic planning became visible in human terms, soldiers surviving because the machinery behind them never faltered. By late afternoon, Ellis joined General Patton's staff via secure communication. Tactical decisions were inseparable from the broader industrial context. Patton's aggressive maneuvers, planned weeks in advance, depended entirely on predictable supply flows and guaranteed replacement vehicles. The impossible scale of American output transformed strategic risk into calculated advantage. Every assault, every flank maneuver, every engagement was underwritten by factories thousands of miles away. The relationship between democracy, industry, and strategy crystallized. Abundance enabled initiative, and initiative, in turn, multiplied the value of abundance. As twilight settled over the French countryside, Ellis stood at a balcony overlooking Versailles Gardens, reflecting on the irony. Victory had always been considered a measure of battlefield brilliance, but here, it was engineered. Every figure on the production ledger, every metric on the logistics report, and every analytic projection converged to create a war-winning engine. Soldiers fought bravely, yes, but the real battlefield advantage lay in a system that could sustain, replace, and overwhelm. The war's momentum, once begun, was self-perpetuating, propelled by the unlikely union of democracy, ingenuity, and relentless productivity. The sun disappeared below the horizon, casting long shadows across the map table. Ellis looked at the carefully inked lines marking front lines and supply routes, and realized that the future of warfare had been irrevocably changed. The American way, democracy armed with industrial might, had proven unstoppable. And yet, beyond the numbers, beyond the calculations, was the undeniable proof that human determination, when amplified by production, could shape history. The next chapter, she knew, would be about legacy, about the long reach of this victory into the post-war world. The sun rose over Washington, casting a gold sheen across the reflecting pool. In the National Archives, rows of crates contained documents, blueprints, and photographs chronicling the unparalleled American war effort. Archivist Thomas Green ran his fingers over the maps, tracing the contours of campaigns, the concentration of factories, and the flow of material across oceans. The scale of the effort remained almost impossible to comprehend. 300,000 aircraft produced over 4 years, 88,000 tanks assembled, and hundreds of thousands of trucks, ships, and artillery pieces moving inexorably toward the front. These were not abstract numbers, but living testaments to a nation that had mobilized its citizens with unmatched coordination, purpose, and ingenuity. Across the country, veterans recalled the relentless tempo of production that had defined the war years. Factory workers remembered the long shifts, the smell of heated metal, the whine of lathes, and the camaraderie that transformed civilian labor into battlefield impact. Soldiers spoke of arriving in battle with reliable weapons, sufficient fuel, and consistent supplies, luxuries their enemies could scarcely imagine. One letter from a Sherman tank commander highlighted that his unit, often outnumbered, had never been outgunned thanks to consistent resupply, superior armor, and relentless air cover. The correspondence painted a vivid image of victory made possible by democratic abundance, a concept that seemed almost abstract until tied to human experience. Strategists reflected on the broader implications. The war had demonstrated that industrial capacity could decisively shape geopolitical outcomes. American military democracy was reinforced not only through battlefield valor, but by systems capable of sustaining overwhelming operations. Enemy planners, forced to contend with the relentless rhythm of American production, had little choice but to defend against an opponent whose scale and redundancy were impossible to counter. The synergy between civic engagement, industrial capacity, and strategic foresight had created a model that would influence post-war military planning for decades. Education and public memory became critical in shaping the post-war understanding of victory. Museums displayed M4 Shermans alongside P-51 Mustangs, alongside the tools and jigs that built them. Exhibits emphasized that the triumph had been collective, engineers, factory workers, and soldiers all contributing to the same overarching goal. Statistics that had once seemed impossible, one factory producing more than an enemy nation, daily output exceeding entire campaigns' requirements, were presented as factual evidence of a uniquely American approach. Abundance, generosity, and organizational ingenuity were the weapons that had proven more powerful than scarcity and tyranny. The final files Greene opened were personal. Photographs of families sending care packages, letters of encouragement to troops, and daily reports from foremen tracking every component leaving the assembly lines. These documents told the same story as the metrics. Democracy had been armed with precision and purpose. Human sacrifice and industrial power had merged to create a force that could not be defeated by conventional methods alone. Victory, measured in both numbers and lives preserved, was the result of a meticulously engineered system, one that demonstrated that freedom, when mobilized efficiently, could achieve what totalitarian ambition never could. As the day faded into dusk, Greene stood outside the archives, watching the Washington Monument rise against the darkening sky. He imagined the tanks, planes, and ships of the past traversing oceans and deserts, each unit a manifestation of national will. The legacy of abundance and ingenuity had not ended with the war. It persisted in strategy, policy, and memory. Future generations would inherit a world shaped not only by battlefield brilliance but by the extraordinary capacity of a free people united by purpose. The war had ended, but the principles of production, democracy, and disciplined innovation would endure, a testament to the idea that a nation of citizens could, collectively, overcome tyranny in ways previously unimaginable. The final thought lingered in Greene's mind as he walked away. America's greatest weapon had never been a single tank, plane, or bullet. It had been the fusion of human courage, industrial scale, and democratic will, a force that reshaped the world and would define it for generations to come. The triumph was not merely military, it was moral, technological, and enduring.